Hey guys, tonight we tell the story of a man who got lost and called it discovery. A man who sailed off the edge of the known world, or at least off the edge of what most people were willing to try, and changed the course of human history forever. But not in the way his statues would have you believe. Tonight, we are diving into the full, complicated, gloriously messy life of Christopher Columbus. The ambition, the obsession, the faith, the cruelty, the triumph, the catastrophic failure, and the strange immortality of a man who never quite understood what he had found. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Chapter 1. The Boy from Genoa. You're born into a world that smells like wool, specifically your father's wool. Domenico Colombo is a weaver and a gatekeeper in the port city of Genoa, Italy, sometime around the year 1451. No one bothers to write down the exact date because no one yet knows that the squirming, red-faced infant in this modest household will one day be the most famous navigator in history. You're just another baby in a city full of them. Genoa is loud, chaotic, and perpetually damp. It clings to the Italian Riviera like a barnacle to a hull, wedged between mountains and sea, crammed with merchants, sailors, and the kind of hustlers who can smell an opportunity from 3 streets away. The harbour is everything. Ships come and go with spices from the east, silk from Venice, saltfish from the north. The port hums with commerce and ambition and, if the wind is right, the unmistakable reek of the docks. This is where you grow up. This is what fills your lungs and your imagination. The sea isn't a mystery to young Cristoforo Colombo. It's just the neighbourhood. Your father is a craftsman, comfortable enough, ambitious in his modest way. He runs a tavern at various points. He deals in cheese. He passes on to his son a particular mixture of practicality and restlessness, the sense that life can be more than what it currently is, if you just push hard enough against its edges. Your mother, Susanna Fontana Rossa, whose name means Red Spring in Italian, is a weaver's daughter herself. You are not nobility. You're not connected to the great banking families of Genoa, not related to any admiral or duke. You're a craftsman's son in a city that respects wealth above all else, and you have very little of it. But you are watching everything. The harbour, the sailors, the traders who come off the ships with sun-darkened faces and impossible stories of faraway coasts. You are absorbing the geography of the world the way a sponge absorbs seawater. Hungrily, completely, without discrimination. School, such as it is, teaches you to read. Eventually you will become genuinely learned, absorbing geography, cosmography, classical texts. But the education that matters most happens at the water's edge. Genoa is one of the great maritime republics of the Mediterranean. Its sailors have been navigating coastlines for centuries. By the time you're a teenager, you already have the look of someone who spends more time staring at the horizon than at his feet. You have brothers. Bartolomeo's the closest to you, a cartographer, a fellow dreamer, the kind of man who sees the blank spaces on maps, not as warnings but as invitations. You will need each other in the years to come. You will lean on each other across oceans and disasters. Your other brother Diego will eventually run the family affairs in a far more sensible fashion than either of you ever manage. But right now, you are all just children of a Genoese wool merchant eating bread and fish, squinting at ships and wondering what is beyond the horizon. There is a story, possibly true, possibly legend, that young Cristoforo first went to sea at around the age of 14. This was not unusual. Boys in port cities grew up quickly. The sea was an employer, an adventure, and for many, a death sentence. You learned the ropes, literally. You learned to read the wind and the stars. You learned to keep your breakfast down during a gale. These are not small skills. These are the skills that eventually carry a man across an unknown ocean and bring him back alive, which is considerably harder than it sounds. The Mediterranean of the 1460s is a busy, complicated body of water. The Ottoman Empire has recently seized Constantinople, slamming shut the overland trade routes to the east that European merchants had relied upon for centuries. The spice trade, the silk trade, the flow of goods from Asia to Europe, all of it has suddenly become dramatically more expensive and dramatically more dangerous. The great trading powers of Europe are nervous. They are looking for alternatives. They are looking for new routes. They are, in short, exactly the kind of audience that a young, ambitious, slightly obsessive Genoese sailor is going to need in about 30 years. But first, you have to survive long enough to develop the obsession. Genoa itself is a city of survivors. It has been fighting for its place among the Mediterranean powers for centuries, always punching above its weight, always looking for angles. The Genoese are not romantic navigators in the way the Portuguese are becoming. They are commercial navigators, practical, calculating, motivated by the ledger rather than the map. But the sea is the sea, and a boy who grows up watching ships disappear over the horizon every morning absorbs something that no classroom can teach: the knowledge that the horizon is not a wall, that something exists beyond it, that the only question is whether you have the nerve to find out what. Chapter 2. The Making of a Mariner. The sea does not care about your ambitions. This is something you learn early, and you learn it the hard way. By the time you're in your early 20s, you have sailed throughout the Mediterranean, working on trading vessels, learning the craft of navigation from the bottom of the ship up. You haul ropes, you reef sails, you sit in the freezing spray on night watch and wonder if the man who assigned you this shift has ever met the concept of mercy. You eat salted fish and stale bread and drink whatever wine has not already turned to vinegar. You get seasick, and then you stop getting seasick, which is how the sea marks its approval. The 1470s see you ranging further. There are records, fragmentary and disputed, of a Colombo sailing in the service of Genoese merchants to the Aegean, to the Levant, possibly as far as the Atlantic coast. You are building a mental map of how the sea moves, how the winds behave, how to navigate by the stars when the coast disappears behind you. The Portuguese are the great maritime power of this age. They have been pushing their caravels further and further down the coast of Africa, methodically, obsessively, funded by a royal house that believes God himself has tasked them with finding a sea route to the Indies. Their navigators are the finest in Europe. Their cartographers are drawing maps that are making the world larger and simultaneously smaller. And in 1476, a convoy of merchant ships you are aboard is attacked off the coast of Portugal. The attack is sudden and brutal, the kind of maritime ambush that turns a trading voyage into a catastrophe with very little warning. Ships burn, men go into the water, you go into the water. The coast of Portugal is miles away, close enough to survive if you are a strong swimmer, and stubborn enough not to give up. You are both. You make it to shore, likely near Lagos on the Algarve coast, half drowned, having lost everything aboard the ship but alive. History has a habit of sparing the people it needs for later. You end up in Lisbon. This is the most consequential geography accident of your life. Lisbon in the 1470s is the centre of the maritime universe. The Portuguese crown under King Alfonso V, and then the extraordinary João II, is funding exploration after exploration. The port buzzes with sea captains and scientists, cartographers and astronomers, merchants dreaming of Asian spice routes and navigators arguing about the circumference of the earth. You arrive soaking wet and broke, but you have stumbled into the one city in Europe where a young man with your particular obsession might actually find an audience. You go to work in the cartography trade, working alongside your brother Bartolomeo. You draw maps. You sell maps. You study every chart you can get your hands on. You begin reading voraciously. You get your hands on Ptolemy's geography, on Marco Polo's accounts of China and Japan, on the works of Pierre Delis and other medieval geographers who had speculated about the size and shape of the world. You are building something in your mind, a plan, a theory, an obsession, the kind that doesn't let a man sleep. You also, crucially, begin sailing with the Portuguese. You go north to England and possibly Iceland. You go south along the African coast. You see the Atlantic from multiple angles. You observe how the winds blow, how the currents run, how the ocean has its own system of highways, invisible to anyone who hasn't paid attention. And somewhere in this period, you begin to become convinced of something that most educated men of your time actually agree on, in principle, which matters. The earth is round. Everyone with any learning already knows this. The debate is not about the shape of the world. The debate is about its size. And on this question, you are about to make a very significant error. An error that will accidentally change history. The question you are asking yourself, the question that will come to dominate your entire existence, is this: if you sail west across the Atlantic, can you reach Asia? The answer, in theory, is yes. If the ocean is narrow enough, if Asia extends far enough east, if the calculations work out. The problem is that most geographers of the day, including the excellent Portuguese ones, believe the ocean is far too wide. They estimate the circumference of the Earth correctly, or close enough, and conclude that the westward route to Asia is impossibly long. Any ship attempting it would run out of food and water long before landfall. They are, as it happens, absolutely correct about this. The ocean is indeed too wide to sail to Asia going west. You, however, have made several convenient miscalculations. You have accepted a smaller estimate of the Earth's circumference from the ancient geographer Marinus of Tyre. You have misread the length of a degree of latitude, using a shorter Italian mile, instead of the standard Arabic mile used by Arab geographers. You have taken Marco Polo's description of Japan sitting 1,500 miles off the Asian coast and added that distance to your already optimistic calculation. The result is a number that makes the westward voyage to Asia look not only possible but practical. You believe Japan is roughly where the Bahamas actually are. You are wrong by several thousand miles of ocean and an entire continent, but you don't know that yet. No one does. And your wrongness is about to become the most productive mistake in the history of navigation. The Lisbon years are also the years you develop the persona that will carry you through decades of rejection. You become, in this period, a man of enormous self-presentation. You dress well when you can afford it, and when you cannot afford it, you dress well anyway. You carry yourself with the confidence of someone who has already arrived at the destination everyone else is still trying to map. You cultivate relationships with learned men. You read. You annotate your books in the margins with a furious, cramped handwriting that still survives. Comments in Latin and Spanish and Portuguese. Arguing with ancient geographers, quoting scripture, noting points of interest. The notations of a man in constant conversation with the accumulated knowledge of the world. The margins of his books are one of the most revealing documents Columbus left behind. They show a mind that was genuinely extraordinary in its appetite, if not always reliable in its conclusions. You also meet, somewhere in this period, a man named Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, a Florentine physician and geographer who's been corresponding with the Portuguese court about the possibility of a westward route to Asia. His letter to the Portuguese, with its optimistic calculation of ocean distances, reaches you and becomes one of your foundational texts. You are not the originator of the westward idea. That matters. The idea was in the air. What you provide is the obsession, the refusal to let it remain theoretical, and the specific mixture of miscalculation and determination that eventually turns the idea into a fleet of 3 ships pointed west from the Canary Islands on a September morning in 1492. Chapter 3, Rejection, Marriage, and the Long-Wait Love, finds you in Lisbon, as love tends to find ambitious young men, at precisely the moment when you are also trying to convince the most powerful royal house in Europe to fund a maritime expedition. Her name is Felipa Moniz Perestrello, and she is not a weaver's daughter. She comes from a family of minor Portuguese nobility. Her father had been the hereditary governor of Porto Santo, one of the Madeira Islands out in the Atlantic. This is not just a romantic connection, it is a useful one. Through Felipa's family you gain access to navigation charts, to Atlantic sailing records, to the kind of institutional maritime knowledge that money cannot simply buy. You also gain a wife who believes in you, which in the years of rejection ahead will matter more than any chart. You and Felipa settle in Porto Santo for a time, possibly also Madeira. You're at the edge of the known Atlantic now. The islands feel like a jumping-off point, a launching pad. The wind blows from the east. Beyond the horizon, to the west, is nothing anyone has mapped. You sail around the islands. You watch the ocean. Strange debris occasionally washes ashore. Exotic plants, carved wood, objects that don't belong to any known European or African culture. You file these observations away. They become part of the mental dossier you are assembling in favour of your theory. You are not imagining things. This debris is real. It is almost certainly coming from a direction no one has yet reached. But you interpret it as evidence of nearby islands, perhaps even Asia's eastern shores, rather than what it actually is, the distant edge of an entirely unknown world. A son is born to you and Felipa. Diego Colombo arrives around 1480. He is your heir, your reason for pushing forward, one of the human anchors of your life. But Felipa does not survive much longer. She dies, probably in the early 1480s, and you're left a widower in your early 30s with a small son, a grand theory, and a kingdom to persuade. There is grief here, real grief, though the historical record doesn't linger on it. What the record shows is a man who keeps moving. Grief and ambition don't always cancel each other out. Sometimes they fuel the same fire. You go to the Portuguese court. You present your plan, which you will eventually come to call the Enterprise of the Indies, to King João II. You ask for ships. You ask for funding. You ask, with the confidence of a man who has convinced himself that he is absolutely right, for titles and honours to be granted in advance, a contractual share of whatever wealth the voyage discovers. The Portuguese response is polite, careful, and ultimately negative. João II convenes a panel of experts to evaluate your proposal. The experts conclude, quite sensibly, that your calculations of the ocean's width are far too optimistic. They are correct. They send you away. You do not take this well. You have never been a man who takes rejection gracefully. It is one of your worst qualities, and also, paradoxically, one of the things that eventually makes your voyage possible. You are constitutionally incapable of accepting no. It is a character flaw that happens to serve history rather well. You pack up your son Diego and you leave Portugal. You go to Spain. It is 1485, and you have a plan, a son, and a stubborn refusal to believe that the world has correctly assessed your idea. Castile and Aragon have recently been united through the marriage of Fernando II and Isabel I, the famous Catholic monarchs whose names you know even if you've never met them. They are in the middle of a war to push the Moorish kingdom of Granada off the Iberian Peninsula, a project that has consumed the Spanish treasury for years. They don't have a lot of money for speculative ocean voyages, but you present yourself anyway. The years of Spanish lobbying are grim. You leave Diego with the friars at the monastery of La Rábida near Huelva, where the monks are kind and the food is consistent, and your son will be educated properly while you chase your dream around the courts of Castile. You are introduced to various nobles, various committees. You catch the attention of the powerful Duke of Medina, Sidonia, and the Duke of Medina Celi, but neither can commit to funding an expedition of this scale without royal backing. You follow the royal court as it moves from city to city, a peripatetic beggar with enormous ambitions and very little money, trying to stay presentable enough to be let into rooms where decisions are made. Spain in these years is a country in motion, constantly repositioning itself around the great project of the Reconquista. You are a foreigner in it, a Genoese with a Portuguese accent and an Italian name, and a plan that most of the educated people who hear it consider somewhere between bold and deranged. You do not speak Castilian perfectly. You are not connected to any of the great families. You have no military record, no hereditary title, nothing that in the social economy of 15th century Spain marks you as someone whose judgment can be trusted with ships and money and the crown's prestige. You have only your certainty and your willingness to talk about it at length to anyone who will listen. Queen Isabel is interested. She assigns her own commission of experts to examine your proposal. They deliberate for years. Years. You sit in Spain, getting older, getting poorer, watching your great idea age alongside you. The commission eventually reports back with something close to the Portuguese conclusion. The ocean is too wide, the plan is too risky, the math doesn't hold up. Isabel essentially says, not now. The Granada campaign must finish first. You visit the Portuguese court again, around 1488, and you arrive at precisely the moment Bartolomeu Dias sails back into Lisbon harbour, having rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. The sea route to Asia around Africa is suddenly looking very real, very Portuguese, and very much the kind of discovery that makes your westward proposal look redundant. Portugal is not interested in you now. They have their route. You leave again, more frustrated than ever. You think about approaching France. You think about England. Your brother Bartolomeo does approach these courts with modest success in terms of attention, and almost no success in terms of money. You are running out of options, and you know it. But then, in January of 1492, the Granada War ends. The last Moorish sultan hands over the keys to the Alhambra Palace, and Fernando and Isabel have their triumph. The Reconquista is complete. Spain is unified. There is suddenly money and attention to spare for other projects, and there is also perhaps a spiritual ambition that needs a new outlet. The Catholic monarchs have just finished one crusade, a man proposing a voyage that could bring Christianity to the far reaches of Asia, and incidentally vast wealth to the Spanish crown, might find a more receptive audience now. Chapter 4. The Agreement and the Departure. There is a moment that may or may not have happened, depending on which account you believe, where you are already, walking away from Spain for good. You have saddled a mule and you are heading toward France. You are 40 years old, roughly, and you have been fighting for this idea for the better part of a decade. The monk Juan Perez, who has been a tireless advocate on your behalf at the Spanish court, sends an urgent message to Queen Isabel. She calls you back, and this time the answer is different. The negotiations that follow are extraordinary in their boldness. You are not a man who enters negotiation with modest demands. You want to be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, with all the privileges and honours of that rank. You want to be appointed Viceroy and Governor-General over any lands you discover. You want 10% of all revenues derived from those lands. These are not the requests of a humble sailor looking for a job. These are the demands of a man who either has supreme confidence in himself or supreme confidence in his ability to fake supreme confidence, and probably both. The court, advisors are appalled. The terms are outrageous for someone who hasn't yet proved a single thing. But Isabel agrees. The document, known as the Capitulations of Santa Fe, is signed in April 1492. You have your deal. The outfitting of the expedition falls to the town of Palos de la Frontera, which owes the crown a debt of service, and to a pair of wealthy local shipowners, the Pinzon brothers, particularly Martin Alonso Pinzon, who is a skilled navigator in his own right, and whose involvement is genuinely crucial. Without the Pinzons and their connections and their practical maritime knowledge, it is very possible this expedition never actually sails. History tends to write Columbus as a lone visionary, but the actual logistics were considerably more collaborative and considerably more difficult than the legend suggests. 3 ships are fitted out. The flagship is the Santa Maria, a medium-sized merchant vessel called a now, heavy and relatively slow but with good cargo capacity. The Pinta is faster, a caravel, commanded by Martin Alonso Pinzon. The Niña, also a caravel and the smallest of the 3, is commanded by Vicente Yañez Pinzon, Martin's brother. The ships are provisioned for roughly a year. The crew numbers about 90 men in total across the 3 vessels, a mix of experienced sailors, adventurers, some men who are there because they owe debts or are running from trouble, and at least one converso, a converted Jew, in the person of the interpreter Luis de Torres, whose Arabic is apparently considered useful for communicating with Asian rulers. That detail alone tells you something about the nature of the geographical confusion about to unfold. On August 3rd, 1492, you sail from Palos. The harbour is quiet in the early morning. Masses have been said. Prayers have been offered. The men file aboard in the grey light before dawn, and the ships ease out into the Rio Tinto on the tide, and then out into the open Atlantic. You head first to the Canary Islands, a well-known provisioning stop where repairs are made to the Pinta's rudder and the Niña's rigging is reconfigured to a square-rigged arrangement better suited to open ocean sailing. You stay in the Canaries for about a month, and then on September 6th, 1492, you sail west from Gomera into the open ocean, into nothing that any European has reliably charted. The world has never seen anything quite like what is about to happen, and neither have you. There is something worth pausing on here, in this moment before the crossing begins. You are 51 degrees of longitude from the nearest Caribbean island, though you do not know that. You have provisions for roughly a year, though you do not expect to need them for that long. Your crew of 90 men are a mixture of the willing and the coerced, veterans and adventurers, men who believe in you and men who took the job because the alternatives were worse. The ships are sound, the wind is fair, and you are, standing on the deck of the Santa Maria as the familiar profile of the Canary Islands shrinks behind you, watching the last land you know disappear into the haze, and you are, whatever else is true about you, the only person in that fleet who genuinely believes in what you are about to find. That certainty is not nothing. In the weeks ahead, when the men are anxious and the compass is misbehaving and the sea stretches on without end in any direction, your certainty is the one instrument on board that does not malfunction. You have staked everything on this voyage. Your reputation, your freedom, your family's future, decades of effort and rejection. You cannot afford to doubt, and so, standing on the deck as the Canaries disappear, You do not doubt. You look west. You breathe the salt air, and you sail into the most consequential unknown in the history of human navigation. Chapter 5. The Crossing. The Atlantic is not impressed by your ambitions. It is large. It is empty. It is a grinding, endless, soul-eroding expanse of grey-green water that offers no landmarks, no reassurance, and no timetable for mercy. The first week goes well enough. The trade winds push you briskly westward. The Sargasso Sea appears, a patch of ocean thickened with floating seaweed that no one has ever seen before, and the crew regards it with the specific kind of unease that humans feel when nature fails to behave as expected. You have a navigation problem, and you know it. The compass needle is not pointing where it should. You are far enough from the magnetic North Pole now that the compass is deflecting, showing true north and magnetic north as different things. This is called magnetic declination, and it is entirely real, but your crew does not know that. They see the compass behaving strangely, and they draw the obvious conclusion. You are entering a part of the ocean where the normal rules do not apply, where God's protection may not extend, where the ship may be sailing off toward nothing, or worse than nothing. The murmuring starts low. It always starts low. You make a decision that reveals a great deal about your character. You keep 2 logs. One is the real one, your genuine reckoning of how far west the fleet has travelled, the one with the true numbers. The other is a public log, with distances you have deliberately underestimated, so that the crew will not panic when they realise how far from land they have sailed. The irony, which is magnificent, is that your public underestimate is actually closer to the truth. Your navigation, in some ways, is more anxious than accurate. You have been overestimating your westward progress. The land you believe is just ahead is considerably further away than even your calculations suggest. Not that this helps the crew, who are worried about the true numbers they don't even know you're keeping. The Sargasso Sea drifts around you for days, miles of floating yellow and brown seaweed, thick enough, in places that the sailors genuinely fear the ships will become entangled, that the sea itself will grip the hulls and hold them, drag them down into the amber stillness. Nothing like this exists in the Mediterranean or along the Portuguese coast. No one has a framework for it. You keep the ships moving through it, reassuring the men that this is nothing, that the weed is harmless, that the ocean ahead is open. You don't entirely know this to be true, but confidence is part of your job description. Weeks pass. The wind stays in the east, which is good for going west, but terrible for any thought of turning back. The crew's worry deepens. They are watching the sea day after day and finding nothing in it. The food stays adequate, but the morale does not. There are discussions among the men, cautious at first and then less so, about the wisdom of continuing, about what happens if the wind never changes, about what lies beyond the edge of the world. Some of these men are skilled sailors who know perfectly well that the earth is not flat, but the knowledge doesn't necessarily help when you are 5 weeks from the last land you saw, and the horizon is identical in every direction. Martin Alonso Pinzon becomes a complicated figure during this crossing. He is independent, talented, occasionally insubordinate. He pushes the Pinta ahead of the fleet because he is faster and because he trusts his own judgment. There are moments of real tension between the two of you, tensions that will not resolve themselves before tragedy intervenes. But Pinzon also helps keep the crew's nerve from breaking entirely. His confidence in the voyage, when he displays it, carries weight that yours alone might not. On October 7th, the Niña fires a cannon. Land sighted. But it is not land. It is a low bank of cloud on the horizon, and the hope it briefly generates makes the subsequent disappointment harder. The crew's mood curdles further. You alter course slightly to the southwest after, following a flight of birds, the same strategy the Portuguese use when navigating near the African coast. It is a good instinct. October 11th, 1492. The sea changes. The men are looking over the rails, and they are seeing things. A carved stick, a flowering branch, a piece of wood that has been worked by human hands. The ocean is giving up clues that land exists nearby, and the clues are real. At 10 that evening, you yourself see a light in the darkness, distant and flickering. Possibly a torch, possibly the lamp of a canoe, possibly nothing at all. You're not certain. You will later claim the sighting. The debate about what that light actually was will outlive everyone on that ship. At 2 in the morning on October 12th, 1492, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, a lookout on the Pinta, sees the white gleam of a sand cliff in the moonlight and screams, "Land!" Real land this time. Martin Alonso Pinzon fires the signal cannon. The Santa Maria's deck erupts. Men are on their knees. Some are weeping. You kneel on the deck and sing a hymn and presumably feel something for which the word vindication is entirely inadequate. The island is beautiful. It is green and low and tropical, fringed with palms. The people standing on the beach watching the ships approach have never seen a sailing vessel in their lives. They are Taino people, members of a large, complex culture that has lived in the Caribbean for generations. They are wearing very little in the warm climate. They seem curious rather than afraid, at least at first, which in retrospect makes what happens next even more difficult to sit with. You go ashore in a longboat. You are carrying a royal standard. You plant it in the sand. You name the island San Salvador, Holy Saviour, though its people already call it Guanahani. You read a legal declaration of Spanish sovereignty aloud, which is a surreal act in itself, a formal document intoned on a beach to an audience who speaks no Spanish and has no idea what is happening. You note in your journal that the Taino would make excellent servants. You write that they would be easily converted to Christianity. You have been on their island for approximately an hour. Chapter 6. The First Voyage, Paradise and Confusion. You spend the next several months sailing through the Caribbean, and it is, in a way, the most beautiful part of your life. The islands are extraordinary. The water is impossibly clear and blue. There are parrots everywhere, which excites you because Marco Polo mentioned parrots in Asia, which confirms to you, incorrectly but enthusiastically, that you are in the right general neighborhood. The plants are unfamiliar. The climate is perfect. The Taino people who live across Cuba, Hispaniola, and the Bahamas are, by multiple accounts including your own, physically beautiful, gentle, and generous to a fault. They offer gifts. They trade willingly. They show curiosity about the ships and the sailors. You sail from island to island with the systematic attention of a man cataloguing a library. Each new coastline is a chapter. You note the trees, the depth of the harbours, the behaviour of the people, the presence or absence of gold. You are writing home constantly, composing the long letter to Fernando and Isabel that you have essentially been composing in your head for the entire crossing, the letter that will announce your success to the world. The letter you know will be printed and distributed and read in courts from Lisbon to Rome. You choose your words carefully. You describe paradise, because in some ways that is exactly what you are looking at. You are looking for gold. This is not a secret or a secondary motivation. Gold is the whole point, the proof you need to bring back to Spain to justify the investment, to validate the theory, to unlock the next expedition. You see small gold ornaments on some of the Taino, and you ask constantly, through gestures and the one or two words of their language you are beginning to learn, where this gold comes from. They point vaguely. They indicate a larger island to the south and east. You take this as encouragement. You sail on. Cuba is large enough to seem like it might be a continent. You are briefly convinced, or at least you tell yourself you are, that Cuba might be the Malay Peninsula, part of the Asian mainland. You send Luis de Torres and another man ashore with letters of introduction written for the Great Khan of China, because this is the world you believe yourself to be navigating. They find no great courts or silks or spice markets. They find tobacco, which none of you have ever seen before, being smoked in the villages, and report this back with the mild bewilderment of men who have encountered something entirely outside their conceptual framework. Hispaniola, the large island you call La Española, is the crown jewel of this first voyage. It is fertile, lushly beautiful, with rivers and mountains, and a population that greets you with flowers and food. The local chieftain, a man named Guacanagari, is welcoming in a way that moves you. You exchange gifts. You dine together. There is a moment that feels briefly like the beginning of something rather than the end of something, but the clock is already ticking. On Christmas Eve, 1492, the Santa Maria runs aground on a reef off the northern coast of Hispaniola. The flagship is wrecked, the hull fills with water, and the ship is lost. It is a catastrophe that reshapes the entire voyage. With only 2 ships now and the same number of men, you cannot bring everyone back to Spain. A decision is made, or perhaps the decision makes itself. You will leave some men behind. You use timber from the wrecked Santa Maria to build a small fort, which you call La Navidad, Christmas, because the wreck happened on Christmas. 39 men volunteer or are volunteered to stay. Looking back, the decision to leave those men is one of the most consequential of your life, and not in the way you hope. You are leaving sailors and soldiers in a land they have been in for less than 2 months, armed, unsupervised, and surrounded by a population they cannot communicate with, and do not respect. You have given them strict instructions. Treat the Taino well. Gather gold, wait for the return. But you also know men. You have been living with sailors for 30 years, and the specific combination of idleness, weapons, desire, and the absence of authority is a combination that history has never once resolved peaceably. You leave anyway. There is no other option that doesn't involve abandoning the voyage entirely. The return voyage is brutal. The Atlantic in January and February is a different beast from the Atlantic in September. Storms hammer both remaining ships. At one point, the Niña and the Pinta are separated, and each crew believes the other is lost. You compose a message in a waterproof cask and throw it overboard. A desperate message in a bottle addressed to the Spanish crown, just in case the ship doesn't make it, but the cask does. The storms are severe enough that the crew make collective vows to go on pilgrimage if they survive. They do survive. The Niña limps into the Portuguese island of Santa Maria in the Azores in February, where you get a cool reception from the local Portuguese governor, who is not pleased about a Castilian expedition having apparently done something momentous in the Atlantic that Portugal considers its sphere of influence. You eventually reach Portugal itself, putting in at Lisbon on March 4th, 1493. King João II receives you. The meeting is polite on the surface and frigid underneath. João II looks at what you've brought back, the gold ornaments, the Taino people you have brought with you against their will, the tropical birds, the strange plants, the red pepper that no European has tasted before, and he begins to suspect, correctly, that you may have found something significant, and he is very unhappy about it. But there is nothing Portugal can do now. You arrive back in Palos on March 15th, 1493. The Pinta, which was separated from you in the storm, arrives in port the same day. A coincidence, so tidy that it almost feels like a story rather than history, but it is history. You have been gone 32 weeks. You have crossed the Atlantic, found islands, survived a shipwreck, and made it home. The news spreads across Spain like fire across dry grass. Fernando and Isabel summon you. You travel to Barcelona in a kind of slow-motion triumph, the streets filling with crowds who come to see the man who sailed west and came back, the man who came back with gold and birds and people from the edge of the world. Chapter 7. The Triumphant Return and Its Shadow. The reception in Barcelona is magnificent. You enter the court of Fernando and Isabel with your Taíno captives, your exotic birds, your gold. The monarchs reportedly stand to greet you, an extraordinary honour. They confirm your titles. They ratify the capitulations. You are Admiral of the Ocean Sea. You are Viceroy of the Indies. You are, for a brief shining moment, the most celebrated man in Spain. It's a very good moment to be Christopher Columbus. The crowds that line the streets to see you pass are genuine in their wonder. They have never seen anything like what you've brought back. The Taíno people walking in your procession, adorned with gold ornaments, are unlike any humans Europeans have encountered before. The parrots scream and display. The herbs and peppers and strange dried fruits are passed around, sniffed, tasted, examined with the particular intensity of people encountering the absolutely unknown. You are walking proof that the world is larger and stranger than anyone imagined, and you did it. You are the man who proved it. Poets begin writing verses about you. The news spreads by letter and by word of mouth, and then by the newly proliferating printing press across Europe with a speed that would have been impossible a generation earlier. Within weeks, educated men from Lisbon to Rome to London are reading accounts of what you found. The geographers are electrified. The merchants are calculating. The monarchs of other nations are jealous in the particular way that only powerful people who missed an opportunity can be jealous. And in Portugal, King João II is doing the math and coming to conclusions that are making him deeply uncomfortable. The problem with triumphant moments is that they establish expectations. Your first voyage was remarkable. Now everyone wants more, wants it bigger, wants gold in quantities that move economies rather than decorate chieftains. The second voyage must deliver on the promise of the first, and it must deliver fast. The second expedition is enormous by comparison. 17 ships, approximately 1,200 men, priests, soldiers, farmers, craftsmen. The intention this time is not exploration but settlement. Spain is going to plant a permanent colony in the Indies, and you are going to govern it. This is a very different task from sailing across an ocean, and it will prove to be the thing that unmakes you. You sail in September 1493, and in November you begin discovering more islands, the Lesser Antilles, Guadeloupe, Dominica, Puerto Rico. The sailing is extraordinary. The discovery, island after island, each one beautiful and strange, is genuinely thrilling. But when you reach Hispaniola and La Navidad, you find that the settlement no longer exists. The fort is burned. There are no survivors. The 39 men you left behind are dead. The precise circumstances are unclear, but the broad outlines are not hard to reconstruct. Men left alone in a foreign land, armed and confident and tempted by greed, had behaved in ways that made conflict with the Taíno inevitable. The honeymoon between the Spanish and the people of Hispaniola is over before you even return. You push on. You establish a new settlement, La Isabela, on the northern coast of Hispaniola, named for your queen. The settlement is miserable from the start. The site is chosen poorly, the water supply is bad. Disease moves through the colonists with the efficiency of a well-organized army. Men are dying of things that have no names yet in European medicine, and some of the illnesses being transmitted are running in the other direction too, into Taíno populations that have no immunity whatsoever to European diseases. The consequences are not yet fully visible. but they are already catastrophic in ways that will only become clear over the following decade. You are not a good governor. This is the truth that history, even the history that wants to celebrate you, cannot quite avoid. You're a visionary sailor, an extraordinary navigator, a man of obsessive courage and genuine genius on the water. You are also temperamental, secretive, poorly suited to the administrative compromise and social diplomacy that colonial governance requires. You play favorites. You punish perceived disloyalty harshly. The Spanish colonists, many of whom are not the most scrupulous individuals to begin with, find your leadership erratic and your authority deeply irritating. Gold remains the problem. Gold is everywhere you go, and not quite enough. The rivers of Hispaniola do contain gold. The Taino do produce it when properly incentivized. But the volumes are not matching the volumes that were promised, the volumes that 1,200 colonists and the Spanish crown were expecting to see. You respond to this shortfall in a way that will define your legacy more than any ocean crossing. You impose a tribute system. Every Taino adult is required to deliver a quota of gold dust every 3 months. Those who fail to deliver have their hands marked. Those who repeatedly fail face worse consequences. You are not the only or even the worst perpetrator of violence in Hispaniola. Your brother Bartolomeo and other officials participate in and sometimes exceed your cruelty. But you are the governor. The title you fought so hard for now has real weight, and what it weighs is human suffering. There is a priest in Hispaniola during these years named Bartolomé de las Casas, who arrives as a young man and initially participates in the colonial system. But what he witnesses changes him. He becomes the most powerful voice of his era against the treatment of indigenous people, writing detailed accounts of what the Spanish are doing and arguing before the crown that it is morally indefensible. Las Casas names names. He describes methods. His accounts are horrifying, and they are, historians generally agree, largely accurate. Columbus himself is not the central villain of Las Casas' account, but he is the man who built the system that Las Casas is describing, the first governor, the man who set the template. What comes after him is worse in some ways, but it follows the logic of the system he created. You also authorize the shipment of Taino captives to Spain as slaves. The first consignment arrives in 1495, about 500 people. Isabel is displeased. She considers the indigenous people her subjects and therefore not eligible for enslavement, a distinction that is more pragmatic than humanitarian, but which does represent an actual constraint on what you can do. Some of the captives are returned. The slave trade you attempted to establish is, in this particular moment, suppressed. But the broader architecture of exploitation you are building in Hispaniola will outlast your authority over it. Chapter 8. The third voyage and the fall. The second voyage drags on. You spend time exploring the southern coast of Cuba, half convincing yourself it really might be the Asian mainland, requiring your crew to sign a legal document swearing that Cuba is indeed the mainland of Asia. Because if they contradict you back in Spain, you want the record to show unanimous agreement. This is a deeply strange act. It speaks to a man whose connection to reality is becoming somewhat negotiated. Back in Spain between voyages, the reports from Hispaniola proceed. You, the colonists who have returned, are not uniformly enthusiastic about your administration. They tell stories of harsh punishments, of poor management, of a gold supply that never quite materializes in the promised quantities. Fernando and Isabel are receiving letters that paint a complicated picture of the man they have crowned viceroy. They are not yet ready to revoke your authority, but they are watching. The third voyage, which departs in May 1498, adds something genuinely new to the geography. You sail further south than before and make landfall on the South American continent, specifically at the mouth of the Orinoco River in what is now Venezuela. The sheer volume of fresh water pouring from the river into the sea tells you something important. This is not an island. The quantity of fresh water coming from the Orinoco means there must be a continental landmass upstream, a very large one. You become convinced that you have found something you call the terrestrial paradise, by which you mean the Garden of Eden, a specific place that medieval geographers placed somewhere at the far edge of the world. This theory is not universally shared by your contemporaries. On Hispaniola, your return finds the colony in open rebellion. A faction of Spanish settlers led by Francisco Roldan has been fighting against your authority for months. The situation is chaotic, violent, and complicated by the ongoing catastrophe being visited upon the Taino population, whose numbers are already collapsing under the combined weight of disease, forced labour, and violence. You negotiate with Roldan in a way that effectively rewards his rebellion, granting him and his followers land and the right to use indigenous labour. You have made a deal with a mutineer because you have no other choice. The reports from Hispaniola finally become too damaging to ignore. Fernando and Isabel dispatch a royal investigator named Francisco de Bobadilla to assess the situation. He arrives in Hispaniola in August 1500, and what he finds there, bodies of Spanish rebels hanging in the public square, a colony in chaos, a governor whose authority exists more on paper than in reality, horrifies him. He investigates quickly and decisively. You are arrested. Your brother, Bartolomeo, is arrested. Your brother Diego is arrested. All three of you are put in chains and loaded onto a ship bound for Spain. The symbolism is overwhelming. You, the admiral of the ocean sea, the man whose idea changed the world, are crossing the ocean that bears your greatest achievement in shackles. The ship's captain offers to remove the chains once you are at sea. You refuse. You say you will wear them until the monarchs themselves order them removed. This is either a profound gesture of injured dignity or a calculated piece of theatre designed to generate maximum sympathy on your arrival. Probably both. You are always playing multiple audiences at once. You arrive in Spain in October 1500. Fernando and Isabel are moved by the sight of you, or moved enough. They release you, restore your freedom, and receive you at court. But they do not restore your authority over Hispaniola. A new governor, Nicolas de Ovando, is appointed. The capitulations, your treasured contract, are effectively suspended in practice, if not in law. You spend the next 2 years in Spain arguing your case in correspondence and in person, trying to restore the governorship, trying to enforce the financial terms of your original agreement, trying to get 10% of the revenue of an entire hemisphere. The Crown's lawyers are better than yours. The negotiations go on and on. Chapter 9. The Fourth Voyage, the High Voyage. You are 50 years old, more or less. You are in chronic pain. Arthritis has been working at your joints for years. Your eyes are inflamed and troublesome. You have been to the edge of the world and back 3 times. You have been arrested in chains. You have lost your governorship. You have made enemies at court. A sensible man would retire. A sensible man would count the honours that remain, not inconsiderable, and live quietly. You are not a sensible man in this regard, and never have been. You propose a 4th voyage, not to revisit Hispaniola, not to explore the large landmass to the south that Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian navigator sailing for Portugal, is already beginning to describe in publications that are spreading across Europe and that use words like New World, words you have never been willing to accept. You want to find a passage, a strait, a gap, a seaway through whatever these landmasses are, a way through to the actual ocean on the other side, the ocean that leads to the India you have always believed was just beyond the next horizon. You are going to find the route to Asia, even if it kills you. It nearly does. The fourth voyage departs in May 1502, 4 ships, a crew that includes your son Fernando, who is 13 years old and has asked to come. 13. He keeps a journal. He idolizes you. He will spend the rest of his life defending your memory. The voyage is immediately difficult. You are refused entry to Hispaniola by the new governor Ovando, which is a calculated humiliation. Ovando doesn't want you in his colony. He has heard the stories. He knows what your presence means. Trouble, arguments, claims of authority, the ghost of your former governorship haunting every administrative decision he makes. So he closes the port. You are the admiral of the ocean sea, and you are turned away from the harbour of the settlement you founded. Let that sit for a moment. You sail south and west along the coast of Central America, what are now Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama. This is genuinely unknown coast. No European has seen it before. You're looking for a gap, a strait, a passage. There isn't one, not here, not through the narrow isthmus. The Pacific, the actual Pacific Ocean that lies on the other side of Panama, is 20 miles away, at points. You have no idea. No one does. The coast is difficult. Storms pound you repeatedly, storms of such severity that even your hardened sailors are frightened. You later write that no human being has ever seen such a sea. You are probably not exaggerating. The ships are being eaten by shipworms, those devastating tropical parasites that bore through wooden hulls from the inside, turning solid timbers into something resembling wet honeycomb. You are bailing constantly, not as a precaution, but as the only thing standing between you and the bottom of the ocean. Men are sick. The food is spoiling in the heat. The coast offers no safe harbour and no way through. There are encounters with indigenous people along the way, some friendly, some not. There is a skirmish near what is now Panama. There is gold found and traded for, which matters enormously to you because gold is still the proof that makes everything else credible back in Spain. But the ships are deteriorating faster than the gold is accumulating, and the mathematics of survival are beginning to look unfavourable. In June 1503, 2 of your 4 ships are so worm-eaten that they have to be abandoned on the coast of Panama. You limp north toward Hispaniola with the remaining 2 vessels, both of them barely floating. You never make it. You beach the ships on the coast of Jamaica in June 1503, and they are too damaged to float again. You are stranded. You are sick. Your men are sick. You are on Jamaica with no ships, no rescue in sight, and a governor in Hispaniola who would probably rather not deal with you. A year. You spend a year stranded on Jamaica. Think about that. A year on a beach in the Caribbean, with increasingly restless sailors, dwindling supplies, and no certainty that rescue is coming. There are mutinies in this period, serious ones, led by men named Francisco de Porras, who take roughly half the crew and attempt to reach Hispaniola by canoe, fail, return, and spend the rest of the stranding as a hostile internal faction. You manage this situation while sick, while conducting ongoing negotiations with the local Taíno population to keep the food supply coming, while writing letters you have no reliable way to send. One of your officers, Diego Mendez, performs what is genuinely one of the bravest acts of this entire saga. He crosses 450 miles of open water in a canoe, paddled by Taíno rowers, to reach Hispaniola and arrange a rescue. Governor Ovando is in no particular hurry to send help. He takes his time. The rescue finally arrives in June 1504, and you sail back to Spain, arriving in November 1504, broken in body but still fighting in spirit, still convinced that the passage to Asia exists and that you found the eastern coast of Asia and that the crown owes you considerably more money than it has paid. There is one more moment from the Jamaica stranding worth telling. At a certain point, the Taino grow tired of feeding your crew, which is fair enough, and begin cutting off the food supply. You know from your almanac that a lunar eclipse is coming. You summon the local chiefs and you tell them that God is angry at their lack of generosity and will demonstrate his anger by darkening the moon. On the predicted night, the eclipse happens on schedule. The chiefs are alarmed and promise food in exchange for God's forgiveness. You go back to your cabin and wait for the eclipse to pass, and then you come out and tell them that God has relented. It works. It is the cleverest thing you do on the entire voyage. It is also exactly the kind of thing that keeps feeding the myth of Columbus, the wily European outwitting the credulous native, though the more honest framing is simply a sick man on a beach running out of options, using the only tool he has left. You never sail again. Chapter 10. The Last Years. Queen Isabel dies on November 26, 1504, just weeks after you return from Jamaica. She was your greatest patron, the monarch who ultimately said yes when everyone else said no. Her death removes your most sympathetic ear at court. Fernando, now ruling alone, is considerably less interested in you and considerably more interested in the administrative challenges of governing a rapidly expanding empire. You write letters. You petition, you argue the capitulations, you insist on your 10%, the lawyers argue back. You are in Seville mostly in these last years. You are in physical decline. The arthritis is severe. Gout has joined the party. You can barely walk on bad days. You dictate letters when your hands don't cooperate. You assemble a collection of documents, the Book of Privileges, a compilation of all the royal grants and promises made to you, carefully preserved and copied, because you know that documents are the only thing that outlast memories and loyalties. You are preparing your legal case not just for your own lifetime, but for your son Diego's, because Diego's going to spend years fighting the same battles in court after you are gone. There is something quietly heartbreaking about these last years if you allow yourself to look at them honestly. Here is the man who crossed the Atlantic, who spent 5 weeks sailing into the unknown, who survived storms that would have ended lesser men, who navigated by stars and birds and the colour of the water, and was nearly always right, now confined to a room in Seville, too sick to walk without assistance, dictating letters to a court that is polite in its non-responses, fighting over percentages and titles with lawyers who outlast admirals. The ocean that made him cannot help him now. The sea that was always his true element is thousands of miles away, and between him and it lies a body that has been pushed past its limits for 30 years. He is not passive in these years. He is never passive. He writes letters that have survived 5 centuries, and still convey a man of fierce intelligence and wounded pride, a man absolutely certain that he has been wronged and absolutely committed to proving it. He is also, in his lucid way, sorting out his legacy, the version of himself he wants to leave behind. He corresponds with his son Fernando. He corresponds with his brother Bartolomeo. He revises his account of the voyages, emphasizing the providential nature of his mission, the sense that God had chosen him specifically for this work, and that the evidence of divine favor was everywhere in his story. Your brother Bartolomeo is with you. Faithful, steady Bartolomeo, who went to the English and French courts for you decades ago, who served as your governor in Hispaniola during the worst years, who was arrested in chains alongside you. He is here at the end, the same as he was at the beginning. Some things hold. You also have, in these last years, a second son, Fernando, the boy who went with you to Jamaica, born to a woman named Beatriz de Arana, your companion, and perhaps the great emotional sustainer of your middle years, though you never married her. Fernando grows up to be a scholar, a collector, a man who amasses one of the great private libraries of the 16th century and writes the first full biography of his father. It is not always accurate, it is always loyal. Fernando Columbus is, in his way, the keeper of the flame. You dictate a document called the majorat, a kind of trust or entail for your family and descendants, laying out how the wealth and titles and honours you believe you are owed should be managed and preserved in perpetuity. You mention your debts, real ones, financial obligations from the voyages that have not been repaid. You mention your hopes for the restoration of Jerusalem to Christendom, because you have always seen your voyages, in partly religious terms, as part of a larger divine plan that includes crusade, that includes bringing the wealth of the Indies to bear on reclaiming the Holy Land. This is not cynical posturing. You believe it. You have always, at some fundamental level, understood yourself as an instrument of providence rather than merely a sailor in search of a trade route. You move, in the late spring of 1506, to Valladolid. The court is there. You are there to continue petitioning, because you cannot stop petitioning any more than you could stop sailing. But you are running out of time. The illness is worsening. The pain is constant. On May 20th, 1506, attended by your sons and your brother and a priest, Christopher Columbus dies. He is in his mid-50s. The exact cause, as with most deaths of this era, is imprecisely recorded. Possibly reactive arthritis, possibly writer's syndrome, possibly the accumulated damage of a life spent at sea in all weather. He dies believing, or at least maintaining, that he had reached Asia. He dies believing he is owed more than he was paid. He dies certain that history will vindicate him. On at least the last point, he is right, though the vindication is considerably more complicated than he anticipated. Chapter 11. What he found and what he didn't know. He found here is the great irony at the heart of Christopher Columbus. The thing that made him famous is not what he thought he did. He believed he had found Asia. He had found the Americas. He believed he had opened a trade route to the Indies. He had opened a door through which 5 centuries of colonization, migration, exploitation, cultural exchange, slavery, genocide, and civilization would flow. He believed he was completing a mission given to him by God. He had instead stumbled into 2 continents that no European had systematically reached before, containing hundreds of millions of people, thousands of cultures, unimaginable biodiversity, and resources that would reshape the global economy for centuries. He never knew. This is the thing that trips people up when they think about Columbus. He made 4 voyages. He explored Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Trinidad, the coast of Venezuela, the coast of Central America. He never set foot in North America, never saw Mexico, never encountered the Aztec or the Inca. He went to his grave believing that Cuba was a peninsula of Asia, that Venezuela was the Garden of Eden, that a strait connecting his ocean to the Pacific would eventually be found where he had been sailing. He was wrong about all of it, and his wrongness, paradoxically, may have been what made the voyages happen at all, because a man who correctly understood the distance to Asia would never have attempted the crossing. The error was the engine. Other navigators figured it out faster. Amerigo Vespucci, on his voyages to the South American coast in 1499 and 1501 to 1502, concluded that what he was looking at was not Asia but an entirely separate landmass, a new world, and he wrote about it in publications that spread across Europe with remarkable speed. German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller put the word America on a map in 1507, crediting Vespucci with the discovery of the New World. The name stuck, on the southern continent first, and then on both. Columbus's name went on nothing geographic except the District of Columbia and the country of Colombia, named for him much later. He is possibly the only person to change world history so completely without getting a continent named after him. The Taino people of the Caribbean, the people who greeted him on that beach in October 1492, did not survive the encounter in any meaningful demographic sense. Within 50 years of contact, the indigenous population of Hispaniola, estimated at between a few 100,000 and several million at contact depending on which scholar you ask, had effectively collapsed. Disease was the primary killer, smallpox and influenza and other European pathogens against which the Taino had no immune history. But forced labour, violence, displacement, and the wholesale destruction of the social structures that supported life all contributed to a catastrophe of staggering dimensions. The Columbian exchange, the transfer of plants and animals and microbes between the old and new worlds that Columbus initiated, is one of the most significant biological events in human history. It brought tomatoes, potatoes, maize, chocolate, tobacco, and syphilis from the Americas to Europe. It brought smallpox, measles, horses, and sugar cane from Europe to the Americas. The exchange is still happening. The world we live in today, its cuisine, its agriculture, its epidemiology, is profoundly shaped by what began when 3 ships appeared off a Caribbean beach in October 1492. There is also this. The question of who gets credit for discovering the Americas is itself complicated beyond Columbus. The Norse explorer Leif Erikson reached North America around the year 1000, 5 centuries before Columbus, and established a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland that we know about from archaeology and from the sagas. The Norse contact didn't stick, didn't propagate, didn't change the world. The Chinese navigator Zheng He ranged across the Indian Ocean in the early 15th century, reaching Africa, but did not reach the Americas. Various other theories circulate, some credible and some not, about pre-Columbian contacts between the Americas and the rest of the world. None of them resulted in the permanent, world-altering connection that Columbus's voyages produced. Whatever its flaws, whatever the suffering it unleashed, the 1492 connection was the one that held, the one that changed everything, the one whose consequences are still unfolding today in every country in the Western Hemisphere, in every plate of food that contains potatoes or tomatoes or corn, in every life shaped by the history of colonization and resistance, and the long, unfinished work of reckoning with what happened when those 3 ships appeared on the horizon. Chapter 12. The man behind the monument statues of Christopher Columbus dot the cities of the Americas and Europe, and they have been, in recent years, a subject of considerable controversy, with some pulled down and some defended, and some quietly moved to museums, where they can be discussed rather than venerated. The controversy is not meaningless, not mere politics. It is a genuine argument about who we choose to celebrate and what we choose to celebrate them for. Columbus did sail where no European had systematically sailed before. He did open a connection between 2 halves of the world that had been separated for thousands of years. He did initiate a process that eventually produced most of the modern nations of the Western Hemisphere. These are real things. He also instituted the encomienda system in Hispaniola, a form of forced labour that was slavery in everything but name. He authorized the mutilation of people who failed to meet gold quotas. He transported enslaved indigenous people across the Atlantic. He governed with a cruelty that his own contemporaries found excessive enough to arrest him for it. These are also real things. What do you do with a figure who is both revolutionary and catastrophic? The honest answer is that you hold both things at once, which is uncomfortable but accurate. You recognize the sailor's genius, the navigational achievement, the sheer stubborn courage required to sail into the unknown for 5 weeks, with a crew that wanted to turn back. And you also reckon with the fact that the same man who crossed the ocean also wrote in his journal on his first day ashore among the Taino that these people would be easy to subjugate. The exploration and the exploitation are not separate chapters in his story. They begin on the same beach, on the same day, in the same journal entry. He was a man of his time in some ways, and in other ways he was not even up to the standards of his time. His governor's cruelty went far enough that the Spanish crown, which was no stranger to brutality, sent someone to arrest him for it. His greed was noticed and criticized by contemporaries. His theological rigidity, his absolute certainty that he was on a divine mission, insulated him from both practical feedback and moral reflection in equal measure. He was also, genuinely, one of the most remarkable sailors who ever lived. He crossed the Atlantic 4 times. He survived the Caribbean in hurricane season. He managed a year-long stranding in Jamaica. He navigated by the stars and the birds and the colour of the water, and he was nearly always, on the water itself, right. He was vain, frequently dishonest about his calculations, occasionally delusional about his geography. He was also capable of genuine wonder, capable of writing about the beauty of the Caribbean, with a lyricism that cuts through 5 centuries and still lands. He wrote about Hispaniola. It is the most beautiful thing that human eyes have ever seen. He was wrong about what he was looking at, and he was right about its beauty. Both things coexist in the man the same way they coexist in the legacy. Chapter 13. The Legacy That Outlived the Man. Columbus died in 1506, and history immediately began arguing about him. The argument has never stopped. He was celebrated as the discoverer of the Americas, though that word discoverer carries obvious problems when applied to places already inhabited by millions of people. He was celebrated as the man who connected 2 worlds, as the apostle of the ocean, as the embodiment of European courage and curiosity. Monuments went up. October 12th became a holiday in Spain and across Latin America, and eventually as Columbus Day in the United States. He became a symbol, and symbols are always somewhat at war with the people they represent. In the 19th century, Washington Irving wrote a biography of Columbus that was extremely popular and extremely inaccurate, inventing, among other things, the legend that Columbus had to fight against people who believed the earth was flat, a misconception that educated people of 1492 universally did not hold. This biographical romance shaped the public image of Columbus for generations: lone genius, defiant of ignorance, triumphant against the medievalism of his age. The reality was considerably less triumphant and considerably more complicated, as the reality always is. The Italian-American community in the United States adopted Columbus as a particular point of pride in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and understandably so. For immigrants facing discrimination and seeking cultural legitimacy, Columbus offered a powerful symbol. Here was an Italian who changed the world, whose name was written into the foundation of the American story. The Columbus Day holiday, established as a federal holiday in 1937, was in part a response to anti-Italian prejudice. The politics of his commemoration have always been entangled with the politics of immigration, identity, and belonging. In Latin America particularly, the image of Columbus has always been more ambivalent. In countries whose indigenous populations were decimated by the consequences of European contact, the arrival of Columbus is not universally understood as discovery. The day that Spain and the United States called Columbus Day many nations in Latin America now call El Día de la Raza, the Day of the Race, acknowledging both the encounter and its consequences. Indigenous rights movements in the Americas have consistently pushed for a more honest accounting of what began in 1492. In the United States, many cities and states have replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, a shift that reflects both the growing political voice of indigenous communities and a broader cultural reckoning with the history of colonization. None of this undoes what Columbus did, navigationally speaking. The first crossing of the Atlantic, the consistent return voyages, the opening of what became permanent contact between Europe and the Americas, those are real achievements that genuinely reshaped human history. They are also inseparable from what followed, which was one of the most destructive periods in human history for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The two things cannot be separated. The voyages made the colonization possible. The man who made the voyages also participated in the colonization. His sons continued the fight for his legacy literally after his death. Diego Columbus, his legitimate heir, spent years in court trying to enforce the capitulations, the original contract promising 10% of revenues from the Indies. The legal battles went on for decades. The Spanish crown paid some of the obligation, negotiated much of it away, and never paid the full amount that the contract specified. Fernando Columbus built his library, wrote his biography, tried to put his father in the best possible light. Both sons were dealing with a name that was both enormously famous and enormously contested, even in their own lifetimes. The body of Christopher Columbus has been moved so many times that there is now genuine scholarly uncertainty about where exactly his remains are. He was buried initially in Valladolid, then transferred to the monastery of La Cartuja in Seville, then transported to Santo Domingo in Hispaniola, where he had requested burial. Then when Spain ceded Hispaniola to France in 1795, a casket described as Columbus's remains was moved to Havana, Cuba, and then moved again to Seville Cathedral in 1898, when Spain lost Cuba in the Spanish-American War. DNA testing in recent years has confirmed that some of the remains in the Seville Cathedral are likely authentic, matching DNA from his brother Diego. But the Santo Domingo Cathedral in the Dominican Republic also claims to have his remains and is not giving them up. Columbus typically is in two places at once, and neither location is entirely certain. Even in death he refuses to be pinned down. Chapter 14. The Ocean That Made Him. If you want to understand Christopher Columbus, you have to understand the ocean, not as an abstraction, not as a body of water on a map, but as a physical reality, a place that exists before humans named it and after we are gone. The Atlantic does not care about geopolitics. It does not care about the enterprise of the Indies or the capitulations of Santa Fe, or the argument about who gets the credit for opening hemispheres. The Atlantic was here for 100 million years before anyone sailed it, and it will be here long after the last argument about Columbus has been forgotten. But for him, the ocean was something close to personal. He spent more time at sea than most people of his era. He knew the Atlantic in ways that most navigators of the time did not. The specific weight of the trade wind, the feel of the current under the hull, the colour the water turns when you are near land, the way birds fly when they know where home is. These were not things he read in books, though he read voraciously. These were things he learned the way you learn anything that matters, by being in the middle of it, by being wrong, by surviving the mistakes and building the corrections into the bone. Navigation in the 15th century is a science built on trust. You trust the stars, which do not lie but require years of practice to read reliably. You trust the compass until it starts behaving strangely in the mid-Atlantic, and then you have to decide whether the compass is wrong or God is testing you. You trust dead reckoning, the accumulated art of estimating your position from your last known point based on heading, speed, and time elapsed, all of which involve guesswork of a highly educated kind. You trust the birds. You trust the colour of the water. You trust your own intuition, which has been shaped by 30 years of looking at the sea and listening to everything it tells you. Columbus was better at all of this than almost anyone alive. The 4 crossings prove it. Getting there is hard. Getting back is harder. Getting back 4 times is a level of navigational competence that the critics who focus solely on his moral failures sometimes forget to acknowledge. The ocean made him who he was. The harbour of Genoa, the Portuguese Atlantic, the route down to the African islands, the crossing itself. Every time he went to sea, he became more of himself. Every time he came to land, the complications began. On land, there were governors and lawyers and queens and accounting, and the grinding reality that the world did not quite match the map in his head. At Iula, sea, there was only the problem of navigation, which he was extraordinarily good at solving. His great mistake, the one that drove everything, the miscalculation of the Earth's circumference, was not stupidity. It was motivated reasoning, the human tendency to calculate what we want to be true and find the evidence that supports it. He wanted the ocean to be crossable. He found the geographers who said it might be. He ignored the ones who said it wasn't. This is not science, but it is recognizably human, and the peculiar mercy of history is that his motivated reasoning happened to be wrong in just the right direction, because the continent that interrupted his route to Asia was exactly far enough away to reach before running out of food and water. Had the Americas not been there, the voyage would simply have ended somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, and the history of the world would be, in some ways, unimaginably different. He was the right man in the right place at the right time, in the most complete sense of that phrase. Not because he was perfect, not because he was heroic in the uncomplicated way that statues suggest, but because all of his particular mixture of genius and delusion and courage and cruelty and faith and greed and stubbornness converged at exactly the historical moment when such a convergence could change everything. The Portuguese had the technology, the Spanish had the money and the motivation, and Columbus had the idea, wrong in its specifics and right in its audacity, that made both of those factors matter. The ocean was the arena. He was the man who showed up for it, and the encounter between that man and that ocean is one of the strangest, most consequential, and most morally complicated things that has ever happened in the story of the human race. Chapter 15. What 1492 actually means. October 12th, 1492 is one of those dates that divides human history into before and after, in a way that very few dates can claim. The Black Death changed everything, but it happened gradually, across decades. The fall of Rome changed everything, but it too was a process, not a moment. 1492 is actually a moment, an actual before and after. Before, 2 hemispheres of human civilization developing independently. After, one global system, increasingly connected, increasingly interdependent, increasingly transformative. The Columbian Exchange, that vast transfer of organisms between the old world and the new, is perhaps the most significant biological event in human history since the last ice age. The potato, arriving in Europe from the Andes via Spain, will eventually feed populations in Ireland, Germany, Russia, enabling population growth that changes the demographics of an entire continent. The tomato, arriving in the same wave, will revolutionize Italian cuisine so thoroughly that it becomes impossible to imagine Italian cooking without it, though for the first century Europeans regard tomatoes with deep suspicion, Maize, cassava, sweet potato, peanuts, cacao, all of them make the crossing and transform agriculture on every continent they reach. In the other direction, wheat and rice and sugar cane and horses and cattle and sheep change the landscapes and economies of the Americas so completely that the pre-Columbian world becomes almost unimaginable to the people living in those same places 5 generations later. The silver of the Americas, extracted through systems of forced indigenous labor that are among the most brutal in human history, flows into the global economy and transforms it, enabling Spanish imperial power, fueling the development of Chinese and Indian economies, eventually destabilizing European inflation in ways that reshape the social structures of the continent. All of this begins with a sail appearing on the horizon off the coast of an island that its people call Guanahani. The African slave trade, which exists before Columbus but on a small scale, expands catastrophically in the century after 1492 as the decimation of indigenous populations in the Americas creates a demand for labor that traders and colonizers fill by enslaving millions of Africans and transporting them across the Atlantic. The Middle Passage, one of the most sustained atrocities in human history, is a direct consequence of the system Columbus helped initiate in the Caribbean. The descendants of those enslaved people are now a fundamental part of the cultural, political, and social fabric of the Americas. Their presence is a consequence of Columbus. Their suffering is a consequence of Columbus. Their resilience, their culture, their extraordinary contributions to art and music and literature and politics are also, in this indirect but real way, connected to that beach in 1492. None of this is Columbus's fault in the narrow sense. He did not plan the transatlantic slave trade or the demographic collapse of indigenous populations or the inflation crisis of 16th century Europe. He was one man with 4 ships and an idea, but he opened the door, and what came through the door over the next 5 centuries is the modern world in all its complexity, wealth, violence, creativity, inequality, and astonishing diversity. That is not a small thing to have done. It is not a simple thing to have done. It is not a thing that yields to simple moral conclusions. Chapter 16. A Life Reconsidered. Let's come back to the man himself at the end. Wash away the legend for a moment. Forget the statues and the holiday and the Irving biography and the school textbooks. What is left? A wool merchant's son from Genoa who learned to read and taught himself navigation and spent his 20s and 30s building a theory in his head that everyone important told him was wrong, who refused again and again to accept that the answer was no, who made a deal with the most powerful monarchs in Europe by demanding 10% of an Maïs ocean he hadn't yet crossed, who crossed it against all expectation and found something that was not what he was looking for and never admitted it, who governed his discovery badly enough to get arrested, who wore the chains of his arrest as a point of pride, who petitioned for his rights with the energy of a man who has nothing left to lose except his sense of justice, who sailed to the edge of his known world 4 times, who spent a year stranded on a beach in Jamaica, who died still arguing his case. He was never simple. He was not the heroic discoverer of the 19th century myth. He was not purely the villain of the counter-narrative, though there is more than enough evidence to make a serious case against him. He was a man of extraordinary gifts and serious moral failures, living at the pivot point of history, doing things that no one had done before, and some things that no one should have done at all. And the 2 categories are not as neatly separable as we might wish. His faith was real. This is worth acknowledging in an age that tends to treat religious conviction either as a quaint affectation or a convenient alibi. Columbus genuinely believed that God had chosen him for this work, and this belief was not merely self-serving, though it was also self-serving. His journals are full of it, Gratitude for favourable winds, terror interpreted as divine warning, the sense that his navigation was being guided by something beyond mere calculation. He carried a copy of the prophecies of Joachim of Fiore, a medieval mystic who had predicted that the conversion of all the world's peoples to Christianity would precede the Second Coming, and Columbus saw his voyages as part of that eschatological project. The gold he was bringing back was not just profit, it was the seed money for the final crusade to reclaim Jerusalem before the end of history. He believed this with the completeness that serious religious conviction requires, and it sustained him through rejections and disasters and chains, and a year on a Jamaican beach that would have broken a man motivated by mere greed. There is a moment in the diary of the first voyage that feels like the truest thing he ever wrote. He is describing Hispaniola, the island he will later help destroy, and he writes that it is so green, so beautiful, that he never wanted to leave it. Just that. No calculation of its gold yield, no assessment of its military potential, no theology of divine purpose. Just a man looking at something beautiful and not wanting the moment to end. The sailor, the real one, before the governor and the viceroy and the admiral and the legend. That man could be moved by beauty, could look at a green island rising from the sea and feel something wordless and human and real. That man crossed the ocean. That man found the Americas. That man died still fighting for what he believed he was owed. That man's error and his genius, his faith and his greed, his courage and his cruelty are so completely intertwined that there is no untangling them without losing the whole picture. And the whole picture, in the end, is more interesting than any simplified version of it, more honest, more useful, more human. History does not give us clean heroes or clean villains. It gives us people, stumbling through their own moment in time with the tools they have and the blind spots they can't see past, occasionally doing something that reshapes the world and never quite understanding the full weight of what they've done. Christopher Columbus changed the world. He didn't know it. He thought he'd found a trade route, he'd found the Americas. He thought he was an instrument of God. He was an instrument of history, which is considerably less merciful and considerably less interested in his personal feelings about the matter. He sailed west looking for east and found something that had no name in his language. And the world has never been the same. Outro hey. If you made it this far, thank you. Genuinely. This one was important to me because Columbus is one of those figures where the easy version, the celebration or the condemnation, is always less true than the complicated version. And I think we owe it to history to look at the complicated version. The man who sailed into the unknown and the man who signed the tribute orders are the same man. The navigator who read the stars better than anyone alive, and the governor who got arrested for cruelty are the same man. The dreamer who never gave up on his idea and the man who never admitted he was wrong are the same man. History keeps giving us people like this. People who are both greater and worse than the story we want to tell about them. And the ones who actually change the world tend to be the most complicated of all. Columbus crossed an ocean. He found continents he didn't know existed and spent the rest of his life insisting they were somewhere else. He opened a door between two halves of the world, and what came through that door was everything. Beauty and catastrophe, food and plague, discovery and destruction, all of it inseparable, all of it still unfolding 5 centuries later in the countries he never visited and the cultures he never imagined and the lives of people who have never thought of him once. That is a legacy. It is not a simple one, but it is real, and it is ours, all of ours, for better and worse, in ways that will not stop mattering until we stop eating tomatoes and potatoes and corn, which is to say, never. History handed us this story, and what we do with it, whether we simplify it or sit with its full weight, says as much about us as it does about him. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what you think. What do you make of Columbus? Is he a hero, a villain, or something history doesn't have a clean word for yet? Let me know below. I'll see you next time.